In this video, I'm going to talk about what Kant calls the paralogisms of pure reason. And so this is where Kant goes after whether pure reason can gain knowledge of the human soul. And so remember in the last video I said that Kant says that reason wants to sort of unify all knowledge as much as possible, and it does that by unifying it into three different things. So there is the soul, there is the world, which is sometimes called the world whole, and then there is God. And so in the Paralogisms of pure reason, Kant has taken aim at whether we can gain knowledge of the soul. And so remember, Kant isn't saying that, the soul doesn't exist, or that, the properties that what he calls rational psychologists or dogmatists say that he's going after what they say we can gain knowledge of about the soul, that it's simple and that it is permanent and that it is self-identical, those three things in particular. And so Kant is saying that those three things are not untrue about the soul, but we can't know through pure reason whether those things are true or false. And so Kant starts the chapter by sort of laying out what a paralogism is. So he says a logical paralogism consists in the falsity of a syllogism with respect to its form. And so essentially it means it is a fallacy, what we nowadays call fallacies. And so the fallacy that he's actually talking about in this one specifically, and we will get to that at the end of this video, is a fallacy of equivocation. And so we will get there at the end of this video. All right, and so Kant, like I said, makes this distinction between empirical psychology and what he calls rational psychology. So empirical psychology is understanding consciousness by what it is conscious of. This should be in what way it is conscious of those things. So consciousness of our temporally located mental states. So it's empirical. It's talking about sort of, what experience actually is. And so he says only here can we determine concepts. So of a subject, every predicate in its negation in existence is chosen to predicate the subject. And so what he means by that is that these predicates sort of, you know, are things that we can apply to different subjects. So pretty much every sort of object or thing that you would come to in experience, to determine it, we have to sort of decide which predicates actually apply to it and which predicates do not. And so when Kant talks about determining things, he's saying that, essentially we say, S is A or S is not A. And then so when we determine it, we actually take one and apply it to our subject S. Then we do the same for the next predicate. S is B or S is not B. Then we actually take one of those and apply it to the subject. Then S is C or S is not C. Then in this case, maybe S is actually not C. And so we don't predicate C of S. And so on for all possible predicates in existence. And so that is what he means by determining a concept. And so you can think about it possibly as saying we know a thing by what it is, but also by what it's not. And so, when we predicate not something of it, that's determining it because we're saying that, we know it, that it is not this thing, that a tree is not a dog, for instance. And so we know what something is by differentiating it from everything else. And so that's why we are determining the concept. And so rational psychology is trying to understand pure consciousness in itself. So the pure I think. And so Kant says that this is not an intuition. So we're not sort of thinking about, you know, the things that we are actually experiencing. We're actually trying to look at sort of the pure experiencing in itself. And so pure apperception. So apperception is Kant's word for the pure I think. So it doesn't have the least predicate of intuition. It precedes all data of intuition, and it precedes a priori all my determinate thinking. So remember, this up here is determinate thinking. So it's also not temporal, but it's the unity of all consciousness. So that's what he'll mean by saying that consciousness is self-identical. It's essentially saying that, the me right now is identical to the me of yesterday and the me of a year ago and the me of 10 years ago and so on. And so Kant says that the rationalists, and the two that he's always talking about when he talks about rationalists, are Leibniz and Wolff, who are two of the sort of most important German uh, philosophers that Kant is always taking aim at when he's talking about the rationalists, or what he sometimes calls the dogmatists. Want to prove the immortality of the soul by proving the permanence of it, because it's a substance, this incorruptibility, because it's a symbol. And remember from the last video, I said what he means by incorruptibility is that, like, it can't be broken down any further. So a symbol is something that isn't composed of even simpler parts. It's something that is completely simple and therefore can't be broken down any further. What we nowadays might think of as like an electron. An electron we would think of as sort of incorruptible because you can't break an electron into other simpler particles. And so also personality, that the rationalists want to prove personality, so the self-identical nature of the soul. And so then Kant goes into each one of these. So the first paralogism is the substantiality. And so he says that this here is sort of the syllogism that the rationalists want to use to prove that the substantiality of the soul. And by proving the substantiality, they think that they are also then proving the permanence and therefore the immortality of the soul. And so substance is defined as that which is the absolute subject of all judgments and can never be predicate, and therefore cannot be used to determine other things. So the thinking being, the I, is absolute subject of all judgments and can never be used as a predicate. Therefore the I, the sort of pure I, is a substance. So my thinking self, the pure I, accompanies every thought that I have. And so it is therefore the absolute subject of every proposition that I can possibly entertain. And so Kant goes into his criticism, and he essentially says that the categories of the understanding must be applied to intuitions in order to have content. So we need we need to be sensing something in order for the categories to have content. Otherwise, they are just purely formal. So intuitions of substance are phenomenal and not noumenal. So the schema of substance, this should be of substance, gives the permanence of substance in time as the determination of time. So essentially the permanence of the substance is what allows us to understand the unity of time. And so that's where sort of this notion that substance is permanent comes from, that we sort of determine time by the permanence of substance. But Kant says that this is applied only to phenomenal substance, not to noumenal substance. So we are, taking in an intuition, we're taking in sense data of something, and we see that its substance is permanent in time. And so that is only phenomenal substance, but we can't then apply that to noumenal substance. And so that's where that equivocation fallacy is coming in, by trying to apply substance to both the phenomenal and the noumenal. But the noumenals is something that we can't know anything about. And so the rationalists make the mistake of applying our phenomenal notion of the permanence of substance to the noumenal notion of the permanence of substance, the latter of which we can have no knowledge. And so that is Kant's critique here of substantiality, and trying to show that the I, or the soul, is permanent, and so immortal, by showing that our sort of I is permanent in our intuitions, which is an equivocation of the phenomenal substance with the noumenal substance. So the second paralogism is looking at simplicity. And so we can go by this syllogism here. So something that is not the concurrence of several things is simple. The soul is not the concurrence of several things. Therefore, the soul is simple. And so by concurrence of several things, we can think of, some object that, some object we have here in space, which we can then sort of break down into, these smaller parts, and then each of these smaller parts we could in fact sort of break those down as well, and keep breaking it down. And so we can think of it as being built from the concurrence of several things. But a thing that is not built of a concurrence of several things is something that is simple. And so that would be, something like just a single point. So we just have a single point, like an electron is something that's simple because you can't break it down into any simpler parts. And so Kant is saying that something that is not a concurrence of several things is simple. The soul is not a concurrence of several things, and therefore the soul is simple. So in order for the manifold of my representations to be unified, i.e. simple, my thinking I must also be unified, i.e. simple, which is essentially saying that when I read the proposition ice is cold, it's not a different consciousness reading the word ice from the consciousness reading the word cold. And so the soul is simple sort of in time. So it's the same soul now as it is, at some later time, even just a split second into the future. And so Kant's criticism here, so we can't infer the unity of the I from the unity of our representations. So the simplicity of the representation of a subject is not therefore knowledge of the simplicity of the subject itself, because we abstract altogether from its properties when we designate it solely by the entirely empty expression I. So much then is certain that through the I always think an absolute but logical unity of the subject, but not that I thereby know the actual simplicity of my subject. And so we see where that equivocation is coming in, where because we are saying that sort of the our experience is simple in that it's sort of a unity, then we can say that the thing that is actually thinking it is simple and therefore unity. And Kant is saying that we can't make that jump. So furthermore, the only I that I can think about is in the intuition, since being in space and time is a requirement for the concept simplicity, so the concept of simplicity to be applied to a thing. As such, the I is empirical, and therefore one cannot say I am simple of the pure I. Additionally, we cannot know that the I is different in kind from matter. Since our experience of matter is always phenomenal, it actually might be the case that noumenal objects are of sort of the same kind of thing or substance as the thinking I. So we can only differentiate sort of the thinking, the pure I, from sort of matter in the sort of phenomenal realm. But it could be that whatever the pure I is, whatever sort of material or substance it's made out of, is the same as sort of objects in themselves, so the noumenal objects. Uh, and so this is from the second edition. So I guess to clarify, by the way, and I've been trying to put it by the quotes here, pretty much everything I'm talking about here is from the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. And so for the Paralogisms, Kant actually changed it in the second edition, and he he shortened it, so he made it shorter. But I think he also made it less clear. So it to me it seems a little more obscure in the second edition version. And so I'm using all the stuff from the first edition, but this from the second edition I added here, which is this refutation of Moses Mendelssohn's proof of the soul's permanence, which Kant added in the second edition. This part wasn't in the first edition. And so Mendelssohn says that the soul is simple and therefore not a composite. So kind of the same thing I was talking about up here. You can't break it down into simpler things. So as such, it cannot deteriorate, since that would assume it has parts and could it has parts that it could lose. Therefore, the soul must be permanent. And Kant responds by saying that the soul might not be able to be broken down into, further simpler parts, but it could fade in its intensive quality, in sort of in the same way that a person's consciousness can fade as they fall asleep. And so that is Kant's response, showing that we could think of the soul as being impermanent if we think about it in terms of intensive qualities rather than extensive qualities. And so the next one is the third paralogism, which is looking at personality. And so we can look at this syllogism here. So whatever is conscious of the numerical identity of itself at different times is a person. The soul is conscious of the numerical identity of itself at different times. Therefore, the soul is a person. So my self-identity remains the same through my entire life. The thinking I is never person A at one point in my life and person B at another point in my life. Only one of my successive thoughts, or every one of my successive thoughts, refers to the numerically identical self. And so that's the thing I've been saying about, the me now is the same me as I was yesterday, and the same me I was a year ago, and so on. And so the soul is numerically identical to itself at different times. All right, and so Kant's criticism here, when we are viewed by others, so the I to which all our thoughts belong is imperceivable, and it could be the case that the I is in the same state of flux as the thought it is having. And so at different times I'm having different thoughts, and so when somebody else perceives me, they to them my I is the thought that I'm having, because that sort of you know determines the behaviors that I'm having. And so these different thoughts I'm having are in constant flux, and so the I could be in constant flux. Also, we cannot know that the thinking I is numerically identical in the same way we can be sure that an object we are perceiving remains numerically identical. So when we're looking at an object, we know that, when we're looking at it at time t0, and we continue looking at it up to time t1, that is the same object that we're looking at. So we know that it's numerically identical. But Kant is saying we can't know this of the pure I, because we cannot intuit our sort of pure thinking I. So the pure thinking I, sort of the I in itself, I guess you could say, we can't actually intuit. And so this is where that equivocation comes in, that we apply numerically identicality to the objects of intuition, and we want to then apply it to the thinking I, but that, but when we apply it to the thinking I, it's a different meaning of numerically identical, and so we can't actually apply the same meaning of it to the thinking I. So it is therefore possible that that the state of my consciousness is actually being passed from one substance to another in the way that motion is passed from one billiard ball to another. And so, you know, one billiard ball we can think of as being numerically identical to itself, but sort of the property of motion that it has can be passed to a different billiard ball. And Kant is saying that, you know, the property of thoughts that the thinking I has could be being passed from one different substance to another. He's once again, he's not saying that this is definitely the case. He's just saying that by bringing up this sort of possible counterexample, he's saying that we can't know that the I is numerically identical to itself throughout all time, and so we are not warranted in saying that we have knowledge of this. All right, and then so the fourth paralogism is the ideality of the external world. So we can look at this syllogism here. So something that can only be inferred as a cause of our perceptions is something that we can doubt. The external world is something we can only infer from our perceptions. Therefore, the existence of the external world is something that we can doubt. So my experience is only ever of my representations in my mind, and therefore I cannot know that there is an external world outside my representations. So, you know, when I am looking at something, uh, the only thing I'm actually conscious of is the representation of that thing that I have in my mind, not sort of the actual thing out there in the world. And therefore, I can only infer that that thing exists out there in the world, uh, and not, you know, only in my mind. And so inferring the external world as the cause of those perceptions is something that happens only in my mind and therefore cannot be proven. So it's something that can be doubted. And so Kant gives this sort of typology here of the different sort of realisms and idealisms in terms of transcendental and empirical. And so I color coded this because uh, Kant essentially says that transcendental realism, which is sort of the notion that space, time, and external objects actually exist independent of our senses and are the cause of those perceptions. So appearances, uh, so what we are actually seeing is the way things appear in themselves. But then he says that this leads to transcendental or empirical idealism, because we, you know, we are only conscious of the actual representations of the things, and so empirical idealism is the notion that all we can know are our perceptions. So the external world is doubtful. Things in themselves just are appearances. And so the appearances that we see of things, sort of the representations in our mind, are the real things. So we can doubt the things being sort of out there in the world because all we have access to our perceptions. And so those perceptions just are the things in themselves. Uh, and then so Kant talks about the transcendental idealism, which is actually his sort of um, doctrine here that he's been talking about throughout this book. So we admit the existence of the external world, but without admitting more than the certainty of representations within oneself. And so these are the same color because Kant says that transcendental idealism is the same as empirical realism. So the external objects are real and that they exist in space, but in the space that in the space that exists only in our intuition, and so matter is phenomenal. And so Kant says that external objects can be thought of in two ways. So empirically external, things that are found in space, so that is the phenomena, and transcendentally external, things in themselves, so the noumena. And so there's this long quote here, but sort of the upshot of this quote is essentially saying that the phenomenal objects are actually real, but they presuppose space, which is something that our mind brings to bear on the objects. Which, this, to me, this always seems kind of like, wanting to have his cake and eat it too, because he's saying that, objects exist only in a representation, since space and time are just ways of representing things, but they're also real because, they exist external to us. So they're real because they exist external to us. So we know that they're external to us, but this externality of them is something that only occurs because we bring space to bear on it. But Kant still wants to say that things are real, and so that's this bold part down here. So whatever is connected according to empirical laws. So the empirical laws, are things like space and time that we bring to bear, things like causality that we bring to bear. So whatever is connected according to these empirical laws with a perception is actual. And so he's saying that, these things are real, sort of outsider representations, but because they exist in space, we know that they're external to us, but space is something that we bring to bear on the objects. And so this always seems like kind of an evasive, dodgy kind of thing to me, but this is sort of what Kant is trying to argue, that the phenomenal world is real, that it actually exists external to us, but external is only, something that we bring to bear with our intuitions of space and time. Well, space in particular. All right, so then what relationship then does the soul and the transcendental world have? So, the thinking I, the soul, the pure I, and the transcendental world, so things in themselves. So since both the soul and things in themselves are unknowable, we cannot know the answer to this question. But Kant warns against taking what he calls a dogmatic skeptical view. Instead, we can only take a critical view. So the dogmatic view is refuting one proposition by accepting another, such as what the proponents of predetermined harmony, so Leibniz, or supernatural assistance, which is Berkeley, who, his argument was that we know that the world is real because, God sort of sustains its reality for us. So that's why Kant calls it supernatural assistance. Uh, so refuting, so Kant says we can't refute physical influence, which is the idea that objects actually exist, and that they sort of move through actual physical interactions with each other. So Leibniz famously talked about predetermined harmony, where objects don't actually interact, but they sort of, it's sort of like this choreographed dance that everything is doing, that it makes it look like things are interacting, but like when a billiard ball hits another billiard ball and causes it to move, it's actually that the first billiard ball moves and then it sort of stops because it was predetermined to stop, and the other one starts moving only because it was predetermined to start moving at that point in time. And so Kant is saying that we can't, when we say that we're skeptical of this physical influence, we can't say that then we dogmatically sort of take some other unprovable sort of metaphysical position. So all we can do is take this critical view here. So critical is refuting a proposition by showing that the proof is invalid. So we're not sort of supplanting one sort of notion of metaphysics with another. We're just showing that the proof of the one is invalid, but not accepting the other proposition in its place. In other words, pointing out that we can't know about things in themselves, but we can be sure of appearances. So for the supposed community between two kinds of substances, the one thinking and the other extended rests on a coarse dualism and turns extended substances through, or though they are nothing but mere representations of the thinking subject, into things existing by themselves. And so that's that equivocation I was talking about. So by trying to say that mere representations of the thinking subject are being turned into things existing by themselves. Thus, the misunderstood physical influence may be entirely invalidated by showing that the proof of it is surreptitiously obtained and void. And so this is what I mean by the equivocation fallacy. So these are sort of the fallacies or the syllogisms that Kant was using. So the incorrect syllogisms. So the soul is substance. You have substance here in green, and then substance here in red in the minor premise, because the substance here is meaning two different things. Same with the simple, and same with the conscious of its identity and conscious of identity. So the words in green are being used in the transcendental sense, while the words in red are being used in the empirical sense. So this is an equivocation fallacy, sort of as seen in the following syllogism. So nothing is better than eternal happiness, where here nothing is better means of the highest value. A ham sandwich is better than nothing, where here nothing is sort of better than nothing means it has some value. Therefore, a ham sandwich is better than eternal happiness. And so, this if you look at this and just look at the nothing as meaning the same thing in both cases, then this is a valid syllogism. But we obviously know, because we understand the different meanings of the word nothing, that this is sort of absurd, that saying that a ham sandwich is better than eternal happiness, because we're using nothing in two different ways here. We're equivocating two different meanings of nothing here. And so Kant is saying that we're doing the same thing in these syllogisms here, where we're equivocating two different meanings of the word substance, two different meanings of the word simple, and two different meanings of the word identity here, where in the major premise, we're using these words in the transcendental, so noumenal or things in themselves sense, while the words in red are being used in the phenomenal or empirical sense. And so that is why these are paralogisms, because these sort of proofs are invalidated by the form of the syllogism rather than the content, where we see here we're using the same form of the syllogism in all three of these here, and all three of them are invalidated because of the form rather than the content. So I mean, that's kind of arguable, because we're saying that it's the content of the words, substance being used in the major and minor premises. But anyway, we can think about it in that sense, that it's this equivocation fallacy that is being made here. But anyway, that is everything I'm going to do on the paralogisms. So I was able to get this into one video. I know for a fact that the next two things, the antinomies of pure reason and then the ideal of pure reason, are both going to be split into probably at least two videos each. But anyway, I hope you found this video helpful, and I will see you in the next one.